Good morning, Chattanooga. All right. Thank you so much for being here today and joining us for our annual Economic Outlook Breakfast sponsored by Bank of America. I'm Charles Wood, Interim President and CEO for the Chattanooga Chamber and also Vice President of Economic Development when I'm board. Thank you for joining us or streaming online. We're delighted to have you join us today and learn more about economic trends affecting business. In a minute, I will introduce Dr. David Altig with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsors really quickly. So first of all, thank you for our presenting sponsor, Bank of America. And thank you for our platinum sponsors, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee, EPB, PNC Construction, and Sandler Training. And then thank you for our gold sponsors, Chattanooga Airport, First Horizon Bank, Food City, Ezell Marketing, Pinnacle Financial Partners, the Sasha Group, a VaynerMedia company, Truist, Unum, and Volkswagen of Chattanooga. Please join me in thanking them. I would also like to thank the Chattanooga Chamber's Board of Directors. I know several of you are here today, and our incredible chamber staff who manage an infinite number of details to make events like this happen. So thank you all very much. We have a great team at the Chamber. They've been fantastic. So I believe the Chamber's purpose is to build a thriving Chattanooga. And yes, we face challenging times with inflationary forces and interest rates at levels we have not seen in some time. But history is a reliable predictor that great companies can rise despite economic uncertainty. General Electric was launched by Thomas Edison heading into the panic of 1893. Walt Disney Pictures was founded just before the Great Depression. And Google and Salesforce launched before the dot-com crash in 2000. Closer to home, some of Chattanooga's cornerstone institutions like Coca-Cola Bottling, Chattanooga Times Free Press, Chatham, Erlanger Hospital, Miller & Martin, Unum, and even the Chattanooga Chamber were founded during times of economic downturns. We don't know what challenges that lie ahead, but we do know that when challenges rise, opportunities follow. So here today to talk through economic trends is Dr. David Altig. David Altig is Executive Vice President and Director of Research for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, where he advises the Atlanta Fed President on monetary policy and related matters while overseeing the research division. He serves in many leadership capacities. He is a fellow and immediate past president of the National Association for Business Economics, a member of the Advisory Council of the Global Interdependent Center and its College of Central Bankers, and a member of the National Business Economics Council. Before joining the Atlanta Fed in 2007, David Altig served as Vice President and Associate Director of Research for the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Most interesting to me is David went to high school, the same high school as John and Jim Belushi. So I'm a little jealous of this, but I have to say those bus rides had to have been a real animal house. He's been gracious enough to share his time with us for several years, and I'm delighted to welcome him back in person. So please join me in welcoming Dr. David Altig.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. You guys look great. Can't see you, but I'm sure that you look great. And it's really nice to be here in person at long last after some unfortunate gap in our time together and in this sort of beautiful, very church-like setting, which is appropriate because I want to introduce my remarks with a true story that happened to me in church over the holiday. I was back where my family all lives in Cleveland, Ohio, and as is our tradition, we went to Christmas Eve services, and it was an utter train wreck from the get-go, and not just trying to get 5 generations of the Altigs out into to the seats at church, but rather the technical sort of experience was a mess. So this is a contemporary service, and they were streaming, and So for some reason, the streaming, they decided to set up a green screen out in the kind of hallway that was then piped into the hall where the service was. But the green screen was all glitched, so all you saw was heads of the people doing the lay reading. And I got to tell you, it's oddly disconcerting to hear the Gospel of Luke with disembodied heads floating around. So got over that. It came time for the sermon, and the pastor had a PowerPoint presentation. So I didn't know that was a thing now, but it was at this church. And so he starts his sermon, and he tries to advance the slides. I hope this doesn't happen to us here, to me. And it wasn't working. So somebody comes feverishly rushing up from the back with a handful of batteries and is changing the batteries. And finally, they got that going, and so the sermon was okay, I guess. And then the final part of all the services, of course, is we all sing Silent Night and we raise candles at the very end, and the hall darkens. Or at least it used to be candles before OSHA showed up, I guess, and basically took the candles away. And then we were using for several years these little battery-powered things that we used to hand out to the kids. But, inflation and supply chain problems and all that sort of stuff. So what we did was we called up a candle app that we were supposed to use. But they forgot to tell us that we were supposed to do that. So now Silent Night, the choir's singing Silent Night, and we're all feverishly trying to download the candle app. And, we get it done, and, the last verse comes, and the lights don't go down. So no one's quite, everyone's just sort of looking at one another. Oh, what's going on? The light's supposed to go down. Finally, the guy next to me has had enough, and he leans over to me and says, "Not even Jesus can get good help these days." Can I get the slide deck up? So, where am I supposed to point? There we go. So, you can't get good help these days. I like to think of myself as good help. You just can't get enough of it. So that story was sort of very apt as I'm sitting there kind of experiencing my holiday tradition with this picture in mind. So this is a picture of the labor market in the United States, demand and supply. I'm an economist. It's going to be demand and supply up on any picture I show eventually. The black line there is labor demand, basically the sum of employment and jobs that are available, job openings. The blue line there is labor supply, basically employment and people looking for work. The red area, of course, identifies that discrepancy between the demand for labor and the supply of labor. And you can see that before the pandemic, the big dip there, of course, is the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we were already in this tight labor market situation where demand was outstripping supply pretty regularly for several years. And then it just exploded as a result of the pandemic and is not showing any sign of improving. Now, that's related presumably to this picture, at least according to the conventional wisdom. This is a picture of inflation. That's a picture I didn't think I would see the last time I talked to you in person, for sure. I think the last time I talked to you in person, which I hope nobody remembers because there's no chance it was even close to right. We were still wondering why we couldn't get inflation up to our 2% target. We spent a decade wondering about that. Well, we solved that problem. Might have overshot a little bit. The connection, obviously, between this picture and the previous picture, which I'll explore a little bit more as we go along, is the wage pressure associated with that excess demand for labor is one of the impediments to getting this picture, the inflation rate, back to where the Federal Open Market Committee wants to go, that is towards its 2% inflation objective. This is a good point. In fact, that Jesus thing would have been a good point to say the views that I express are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System. They're my own. So, if I go back to this picture, here's the key question. If I believe that this gap has to close before we see any progress on the inflation front, the essential question is, how does it close? It could close one of two ways, a good way and a not so good way. The good way it can close is that we get more labor supply. That is, the supply side of the economy responds, and that is a situation where jobs are growing, jobs are getting filled, the inflationary pressure inherent in this picture abates without any destruction of employment or economic growth in the economy. The not so good way is if this adjustment has to occur through demand. So the first thing I want to explore is whether or not it seems plausible to think that the adjustment needed in this picture to get where we need to go in this picture can occur on the supply side of the labor market. Spoiler alert, no, or not in my opinion. In my opinion, it's going to be tough. Here's why. This is a picture of labor force participation, the labor force participation rate specifically in the United States. It's the fraction of the population that is working or looking for work. It's the size of the labor force relative to the working age population. So I've shown you two pictures here. One is the overall labor force participation rate. That's the blue line. And you can see what happened. It had been pretty steady running up to the pandemic. The pandemic hits, it drops like a rock, and it's not improving very quickly. People have dropped out of the labor market. So that might be an optimistic story. It might be an optimistic story in the sense that it seems like there's room to run. There's room to bring people, pull people back into the labor market to close that demand and supply gap without potentially pain to the economy. The problem is that orange line. That orange line is the labor force participation of prime age workers. I want to go on the record as saying this prime age language is highly offensive to me. Having fallen out of prime age about a decade ago, I really think everyone else is getting to change stuff. Why can't I change that? I feel pretty prime at the moment. But anyway, prime age is those individuals aged 25 to 54. They have the highest attachment to the labor force, obviously. This is not something that is falling short of where it was pre-pandemic. If you look at that orange line, it's virtually back to where it was before the pandemic hit, which means the core workforce, the demographic group with the highest degree of participation is already participating. There's not a bunch of them on the sidelines that we might hope would get pulled back in eventually as time goes on. What's the difference between the blue line and the orange, or what accounts for the difference between the blue line and the orange line? It's us non-prime baby boomers who are dragging down the overall labor force participation rate. By the way, that color, gray, is what my analyst handed to me. I don't know what message he was trying to send, but once again, not really entirely appreciated. Where did they go? You know where they went. They retired. So the obvious question is, are they coming back? And the obvious answer is probably not. And in fact, what's driving this picture is not the 55 to 64 group, it's the 65 plus group. The rates by which these individuals or individuals of this age come back into the labor force are quite low. We actually spent most of the period of time between the global financial crisis and the pandemic wondering why this age group was not retiring as fast as we expected them to retire. Early on, it seemed kind of obvious. They had lost a lot of wealth as a result of the Great Recession and the global financial crisis, but it persisted even into the late 2010s, 2017 and beyond, and that was not such an obvious story anymore. Whatever the explanation was, we don't have to worry about it anymore because now they are retiring at rates that we would expect based upon the behavior of individuals this age before. So the overall labor force, labor supply side of the story, I think is extremely challenged by virtue of the fact as what we're seeing is basically the natural demographic aging of the U.S. population. We might be able to solve it through immigration, and for a while, immediately post-pandemic, I don't actually know when you date the post-pandemic period, but for a while, it looked like there was a lot of opportunity there because immigration had fallen way off of its trend prior to just the last couple of years, last year, but then it accelerated substantially, and the supply of labor coming from immigration is sort of right back on the pace that it was prior to the pandemic, pretty close. And in fact, if you look at the contribution of immigration to labor growth in the United States from 2021 to 2022, 80% was accounted for by immigration. Now, how much more can we lean on that? I'll leave that as an open question, but it's an open question that I think is reasonable to have some skepticism about. So if you ask the Bureau of Labor Statistics what's going to happen going forward, the answer is labor supply growth is going to remain quite muted. So this is sort of labor supply. I like this picture a lot because it's labor supply growth by decade, basically. And it sort of tells you the age groups that are accounting for the labor force. So we're at lows that we haven't seen since the end of World War II, essentially, on labor force growth. And the aging is very apparent. There's a lot of red in those last couple of bars. And the only reason labor growth looks a little bit better over the next 10 years than over the last 10 years is because of the pandemic. So we have that period of time where kind of labor drops like a rock. That's infecting that last decade number. So look, this is, nobody pretty much believes that we are going to be able to labor supply growth our way out of this. I'll just give a quick shout out to all of the workforce development efforts that Chattanooga area has been very known for. There lies our future, but that stuff takes time. It's not going to happen fast. As a consequence, when we look at this picture, it's hard to come to any conclusion except that the closing of this gap, if it's necessary, to contain inflation and get it back to where it needs to be, is going to have to come on the demand side of the economy. Again, that could happen in a bad way or a less bad way. The less bad way is, remember what I said, that labor demand line is, it's the sum of people who are employed and job openings. So the thinking is you could slow down the desired expansion in employment by employers sufficiently to get this gap under control without destroying jobs. That's the soft landing story in its essence. That with enough sort of restraint on how fast the economy is expanding, the pressure on labor supply coming from labor demand will be mitigated enough to kind of get us out of this, help us get out of this inflation problem. The bad way, of course, is the R word, and basically outright destroying jobs. So how are we doing? How are things going? Well, the committee is pretty much, Federal Open Market Committee now, has pretty much kind of told everyone what the plan is for now in any event. This for now means December is the last time they've sort of weighed in explicitly on this. If you've heard me talk before, you've seen a picture like this probably. 4 times a year, all of the presidents and all of the governors of the Federal Reserve or the Federal Open Market Committee get together and they say, well, here's what I think GDP growth is going to be over the next 4 years, or 3 or 4. Here's what I think the unemployment rate is going to be. Here's what I think inflation is going to be. And here is the federal funds rate target that we think will support those projections. So right now we're about 4.6. That number is about 5.25 at its peak. And you have heard this over and over again from Fed officials. This is a picture of getting up to a particular spot that the committee judges as sufficiently restrictive to meet their objectives, and then staying there for a while through the end of 2024 in this picture. Now, when they meet again in March, they're going to redo this picture. We'll see if it changes, but that was the story as of December. And the soft landing story, I'm not going to kind of try to characterize what's in the heads of the people who contributed to this picture. By the way, that's the median, so there are actually 19 different numbers, but they're pretty tight around this median. So I won't try to characterize what they have in mind, but as an impartial observer, this would be the story of the soft landing, that we can implement this degree of monetary tightness. We here is the royal we, I guess, and see enough softening in the economy to slow things down to close that labor gap, but not so quickly as to throw the economy into the tank. How's it going? Well, if you looked at GDP growth, you might conclude not going so well, perhaps, in the sense that GDP growth at the second half of the year was pretty strong. So this is just quarterly GDP growth at annualized rates. This number for the fourth quarter will probably get revised down a little bit, but not a lot. Will still be above 2, well above kind of what we think is the potential growth rate of the economy. And so you would look at this and say the economy stayed pretty hot in the last half of the year. At the Atlanta Fed, on the staff of the Atlanta Fed, we stopped looking at this picture because we noted that if we pay too much attention to that picture, you might conclude, and there were a lot of people who did conclude, that we were in a recession in the first half of the year because we had 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. That, of course, isn't the definition of a recession. No one knows what the definition of a recession is because there's 8 people who are professors who decide when we're in a recession or not. I think we should basically lock them up so we never have recessions, but that's just me, and I'll remind you, the views that I express are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System. But these numbers are essentially very, very misleading because as a result of the pandemic, there have been wide, wide swings in things driving this picture, like inventories, like net exports, that really are not giving us a very firm signal on the underlying core trajectory of the economy. So we like to look at this thing called final sales to domestic purchasers, which is basically just consumer spending and CapEx, business fixed investment. If you do that, that's the blue bars, it tells a very different story. It tells you you are certainly nowhere near a recession early in the year and weren't anywhere near or weren't in negative growth territory for the entire year, but you also see a clear softening of the trajectory as we go through the end. This is, in some sense, very soft landing-ish feeling. Slowdown, but not dipping into negative territory. And accompanied by actually some significant and noticeable decline in the rate of inflation. This has been associated, however, with more robust spending by consumers than I would have anticipated, and I think many of us would have anticipated. I missed a slide here somehow, but if we look at the interest-sensitive sectors of the economy, that is, if we look at residential investment, this is not news to anyone, and if we actually look at CapEx, business fixed investment, those numbers are weak. Residential investment is just deeply negative. In the fourth quarter, like minus 22% growth or contraction at an annualized pace. And business fixed investment under 1% annualized. So how does monetary policy going to work? Well, it doesn't, it's got pretty limited ways that it can work. One of those ways is to simply choke off interest-sensitive spending and look for the spillover into the rest of the economy. The other way might work through other elements of the financial market, like the equity markets or something like that, and kind of slow down the wealth of the economy and work directly on demand that way. That's the one we don't see so much in consumer spending. But we very definitely see it in the interest-sensitive spending in the economy, which is not painless, which is not entirely fortunate, but it also seems to be exactly what you're going to need to see if monetary policy is going to work to kind of resolve this situation of labor markets that are too hot and inflation that is too high. Now, why isn't the consumer responding? I made note just a minute ago of the wealth effect from like equity markets or something, some channel like that. Why is that not showing up in consumer spending? And anything that we can see thus far from January and a little bit of February, we don't really have much data on that. The consumer seems to really be hanging in there. Hanging in there enough so that, contemporaneous predictions of growth in the first quarter are pretty high. There's over 2% annualized. Well, the reason, kind of pretty clearly, is this. This is the savings rates of individuals. And you can see what happened as a result of the stimulus payments associated with pandemic relief to household balance sheets. Savings rates absolutely exploded, which strikes me as a pretty positive statement about U.S. households and U.S. consumers. They did not squander this largesse that was bestowed upon them, but instead socked it away knowing that it was temporary and there may be tricky times yet to come. And that was true at every level of the income distribution. It wasn't just rich people. It wasn't just poor people. It was across the whole spectrum of income levels that this saving took place. Well, you can see what's happened subsequently. This robust consumer spending is at least in part being supported by running down that excess savings, if you will, that happened as a result of the pandemic relief. How long will it last? Yeah, got no idea for sure. One of the things that we do is we spend a lot of time asking people who have insight into the balance sheets of their customers, for example. So have something to ask some bankers a little bit later on. Who's running down their balances and how far do they have to go before they can do so no longer? Most predictions that I've seen of how long it will take for this excess savings in critical parts of the consumer base to run off looks like something around mid-year, end of this quarter, somewhere in that period. And in fact, there's good reason to believe just from the official statistics that at the lower end of the income distribution, we're kind of getting to the point where that excess savings is about kaput. What effect will that have on this whole scenario about the growth rate of the economy? Well, we'll see. You would expect that it was going to be yield some softening in the economy, particularly on the consumer side that we have not yet seen, that we can then couple with weakness on the interest-sensitive side of the ledger, of the GDP accounts, and then maybe finally get to the point where we can more definitively say whether or not soft landings are in the cards or not in the cards. Here, in any event, is the key picture for inflation. And some of you who are aficionados of listening to like Chair Powell's press conferences will have noted that there's a lot of conversation about a picture like this. This is basically the inflation rate, where I've plotted out the inflation rate for goods, and that's the orange line, and the inflation rate for services. That's the blue line. In the orange line lives the supply chain disruptions and commodity price increases and all of that sort of stuff. And you can see that prices in that sector have decelerated substantially, price increases. This is 12 months. This is the average of the last 12 months, so it would look more dramatic if I did the last 3 months or 6 months or something like that. That is clearly moving in the wrong direction, right direction, albeit not quite at the pace that we would expect or hope. That is, the year-over-year rate of inflation of goods is still up around 3%, whereas in normal times it would look roughly negative, 0, slightly negative. So there's a way to go, but I think most people, most commentators, are of the view that this process of disinflation in the goods sector is likely to continue as either supply chain disruptions, which still are present from what we can tell, begin to continue to improve, or at least businesses learn to deal with it. And the shift towards things like furniture and refrigerators and all that stuff we had to buy because we couldn't spend it on anything else during the pandemic, as the shift away from that stuff continues and the shift into services, things like going to restaurants and traveling and all that, continues to increase. Now that's where the blue line comes in. And the blue line is services, and as you will note, that is showing no sign whatsoever of disinflating or reversing course. None. that can be spoken of. And the problem, bringing this back full circle with that, of course, when you think about the orange line, when you think about goods inflation, what you're seeing is things like commodity prices and supply chains and all that sort of stuff. When you look at the blue line, you're looking at wages. Pure and simple. That's the cost of services is almost all embedded in wages, and that part of the story is the part that makes one concerned about the failure to close that demand and supply gap for labor that I showed at the very outset. Essentially, here's the crux of the matter. This is wages. So the orange line, it's the level of wages, or the level of the growth rate of wages. So the orange line is dollars. It's dollar growth of the dollar wages that people are earning, up and up and up and up. The blue is adjusted for inflation, real wages. Those real wages have just recently turned positive after being negative for some period of time during the pandemic and after. And the question is twofold. The first question is how fat or how long will that process of catch-up continue? And more to the point, how much of that will eventually be passed into consumer prices? So here's what we think we know. We sort of think we know that, and again, we like to get out and talk to all of you because you tell us sort of how right we are about the things that we think we know. But here's what we think we know is that in the data, we know that wages exploded, wage growth exploded in 2021. They've backed off in 2022, but are still at rates higher than pre-pandemic. And typically we hear they're going to stay there. No one's really planning on returning to pre-pandemic growth rates precisely because of this picture. Because workers are still behind in the inflation catch-up story. So, does that mean that eventually that catch-up is going to lead to more price pressures? Or, to put it as bluntly as I possibly can, will businesses take it in margin and profits and earnings, net earnings? That, at the end of the day, is going to be the story. Whether or not the attitude of businesses out there is, there's a couple stories maybe. The attitude of businesses out there is, hey, we had a good run. Now we're going to get back to normal. And we can take it in margin because we had a good run. And I can't get enough workers before the pandemic. I can't get enough workers now. I'm not going to play this game of allowing wages to continually fall behind. We'll just deal with it. And we do hear an awful lot of the story of even if things soften beyond what we're comfortable with, there are a couple realities. One is, as that excess savings is sort of getting run out in the economy, finally, consumers are becoming more price sensitive than they have been. And then second, it is going to be a situation in which I do not want to find myself back where I was pre-pandemic and where I have been for the last 2 years, struggling mightily to get workers. I want to keep the ones I got, and unless things go really far south, that's my plan. Frankly, all of that sounds like a soft landing story. So, am I going to predict a soft landing? Well, will you remember it if I did? That's my metric. If you promise not to remember, I say sure. I have, there is a reason that sort of my boss, Raphael Bostic, has been out typically saying, here's the plan as I see it. And that we're going to get as quickly as we can to a level of the policy rate that we think will be sufficient to slow us down and make more progress than we've been making on the inflation front. But the world is uncertain enough that it would be a good idea to just kind of scope out a roadmap where we get there and stay there and see how things progress. And that's sort of where we are now. So with that, I'd be glad to open the floor up to questions. I guess there are microphones floating around or something like that. Or you could scream really loud.
Good morning.
Morning.
When you look at the Chattanooga economy, we have a larger percentage than average of manufacturing jobs. With our focus on industries like EV and battery and the success that we've had there, does that position us well for the future, or are we going to have trouble filling those advanced manufacturing jobs, you think?
Yeah, so I mean, the kind of obvious, straightforward answer is, well, yeah, of course. If you can attract into your manufacturing base the hot sector of the moment, that's going to work well, at least for a while. So here would be my caveat to this and my general sort of feeling about development. First of all, some of the things you mentioned, EVs, battery technology, those sorts of things, highly contingent for the moment on government support for those industries, and highly contingent in the slightly longer run on what our energy policy in the United States ultimately looks like. The thing about kind of the electrification, uncarbonization, decarbonization of the economy is we have not really tested all this stuff at scale yet. And that's where the hard stuff is going to come. So my first answer is yeah, but there are always these caveats, which leads me to my second kind of observation on this. And my second observation is I'm sure there was a time when the horse and buggy industry was exactly the thing you wanted to pull into your community. But that stuff comes and that stuff goes. So at the end of the day, I mean, this is really, truly just my opinion. I mean, I don't proclaim any expertise on this. And, here's what you need. You need good infrastructure. You need good labor force. You need a good community within that people want to live in. And then the stuff, you build that, they will come. Whatever it is. And I'm a Midwesterner. So, Midwesterners grew up, particularly Midwesterners my age, grew up watching the stuff that the communities we lived in bet on and went all in on fade and leave virtually nothing. So diversification and the fundamentals of what makes a place attractive for investment of all sorts, there's just, that hard work, there's no replacement for it. I don't know if that was encouraging or discouraging. I think it should be encouraging for Chattanooga, but.
Hi, good morning. Or as we come out of the pandemic, one of the trends we've seen in the workforce is working from home. Do you see those trends continuing, and what do you see as the impact of that from like a workforce development side, but also on the economy as well?
Yeah, so if I answer this question with any certainty, you should throw me out of the building, because I'm an employer, and I'm going through the same thing all you are, which is trying to figure out what the workforce of the future needs to look like to get the work done and to get the workers in the door to do the work. It's hard for me to imagine, like I'm sure it's hard for you to imagine at this point, that we are ever going to fully go back to where we were. It just does not seem to be in the cards. But how far that goes and what the implications are, I don't know. I'll give you the example that comes to my mind. The example that it has to do with commercial real estate. So what does this mean for office space, for example? Well, I don't know. So we have a policy at the Atlanta Fed where most people are expected to be in 2 days a week, just 2 days a week. In the research department I'm a part of, it's 3. If you're in a manufacturing or a processing job, then it's 5. If we're running cash around, you've got to run the machines, which is something to think about, the increasing degree of inequality in the experience. I don't know if I want to use inequality, but the divergence in the experience of certain type of workers and other types of workers, that's going to have to be thought about very, very carefully. But in any event, even with only 2 days a week in the office, on average, those days are coordinated. Because the whole reason for saying you have to be in place, even though you have a job that could kind of conceptually be done remotely, we believe that there are cultural reasons. I'm sure this is familiar to many of you. There are cultural reasons to bring people together. The reason the research department has 3 is that our work is thought work, and it's idea work, and we don't do that in a vacuum. So even though now 2/5 of the work week, nobody's in the office, I still need the space for the other 3 days, or 2 days, or whatever it is. How that's all going to shake out, I kind of have no idea at all. So now you've got a lot of excess capacity, but you have a peak load problem, kind of in the very, very conventional sense, is yet you need the capacity for the days that you need the capacity. So what's that going to do to these markets? And what's it going to do to, even when we move over into the commercial part that has to do with stores and restaurants and building those sorts of things, kind of hard to know. There was an article you may have seen in the Wall Street Journal this morning about a big survey they did in the UK, where a bunch of companies cut their work week to 4 days a week, and then they kind of did a gut check on the productivity. And there's virtually no company that reported a productivity loss. Some, like 30% or something like that, had productivity was the same. Others had slight improvements. Some others, smaller group, had large improvements. How did they do that? Well, I really like the explanation. The explanation is we cut out all the meaningless meetings that we were making everyone go. Apparently that was like 8 hours a week at least for the ones whose productivity stayed the same. But can you do that in every type of business? No, you can't do that in every type of business. 4 days actually seems aspirational in some cases. If I can get people in 4 days a week, man, that would be like a major victory. So I think, we're going to go through this long period of time, and I think it will be a long period of time, which I don't think is a negative thing. There will be a lot of experimentation. There will be a lot of false starts. We'll learn a lot of stuff. There will be disruption, and I think in sort of the physical plant space, there will be a lot of disruption, as we will probably overshoot in some instances, and try to have to figure out what happens to urban centers and, all the stuff that you struggle with. But I would not, the one prediction I might make is that we will not get out of having to go through that adjustment process.
I've got a question about the labor market. So here in Hamilton County, we know that about 42% of our neighbors are struggling to meet basic needs, and many of them are working, and most of them 2 and 3 jobs. And so can you tell us what you know about underemployment and, folks who just, aren't employed to the fullest levels, and then what communities can do about it?
Yeah, so some of you have heard me talk about this before. So I'm here's what I think is probably not a durable way to deal with it. A durable way to deal with it isn't through, I'm not going to say what I was going to say. Here's what I think is a durable way. I'm going to get out over my skis on this. I've talked a lot in the past about disincentives to working. Those disincentives take several forms. The one that we spend a lot of time thinking about at the Atlanta Fed is disincentives associated with the loss of public assistance as your income rises, benefit cliff issues, which operate as very, very significant taxes on low-income individuals who want to work, so I have a study that is in its third iteration of refinement that demonstrates a couple things. If you account for the loss of public assistance and you calculate an effective tax rate for low-income workers who might be on public assistance, those tax rates on average are for the lowest 20% of wealth holders in the United States, where wealth includes your human capital, is almost the same as the top quintile. There's very little difference. And the dispersion is enormous. So something like 25% of the least wealthy in the country face effective tax rates that are 75% or higher. Well, if you get to keep a quarter of every dollar you make, and it probably costs you more than a quarter to get to work where you might be able to make that dollar, you aren't going to bring people into the labor force. Which leads to the other sort of collection of problems that have to do with housing, that have to do with childcare, that have to do with transportation, that have to do with health. There is a huge structural, systemic problem that has to be resolved. It is not going to get resolved, I'm here to tell you, by government alone. It may partially get resolved, but it's going to need the input of employers, importantly. Employers are going to have to just figure out, what can I do to solve the impediment of getting workers into my place of business, particularly if you're hiring low-income individuals. Trapping people in these low-income jobs is not our solution. Our solution is workforce development, is skilling up, is being creative about skilling up. And by being creative, I mean things like, I heard this story the other day of a development entity. I won't say more than that because I don't have permission to do that, but it was someone running the workforce development program in their county, and they had invested enormous amounts of resources into building a welding program, because this was like forever the opportunity occupation. Lots of jobs for welders. There's not enough welders. Pays a lot of money. Let's get people welding. Well, they did. They invested all these resources in it, and soon they filled all the welding jobs. And now they had a bunch of welders who had no jobs. And they did one of two things. They were back in the situation they were in before, or they moved out of the county. They moved somewhere else. So the county had spent a bunch of money training them up with no return to the county. So they've pivoted and are now thinking about bundles of skills. For example, that would make someone with maybe a little extra training, but not a bunch, capable of, employment in 5 or 6 different trades. So that if one kind of fizzles away or the jobs get filled, there's a way to kind of take that capital and deploy it in the place where there are jobs. So we've got to, think through all of that kind of complication, and we have to think expansively about whatever our solution is, how do we scale it? This is my big thing these days. My colleagues are sick to death of me saying it, but there's this book by this economist called his name is John List. He's not called John List, that's his name. And the name of the book is The Voltage Effect. The subtitle is How to Make Good Ideas Great and How to Make Great Ideas Scale. John List is an enormously interesting guy. He's a full professor at the University of Chicago. He was the chair of the University of Chicago. He's a well-known kind of experimental economist, but he's also been the chief economist, simultaneously been the chief economist for Uber, for Lyft, and he's currently the chief economist for Walmart. And the whole book is, here's where you're going to screw up. I mean, here are, he's got a list of 6 of them. 6 mistakes when you programmatically try to build a labor force, you try to engage in economic development, you try to build some nonprofit, you run a business, which he's very involved in. Here's the mistakes you make by not thinking about what tomorrow is going to look like. If you got 5,000 welders jobs and you train 10,000 people to be welders, maybe you should have thought through that problem before you invested in training the welders. So it's not just sort of getting skills in place, it's getting a robust labor market in place, robust for the community and robust for the people. That was really long.
That's all
Sorry.
right. We've got time for one
Got
more
on
question.
my soapbox.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming through. Quick question. One, why is 2% the right long-term inflation rate? And 2, I guess this is probably the most televised recession forecasted out there. With the job hoarding that's been happening, you've seen recessionary impacts, as you mentioned earlier, and yet people in sub-industries still have very low unemployment rates.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to make that break if you just stay at 5.25%,
Hopefully-
5.5% over time?
Yeah. So I'll answer the second one first. Hopefully nothing will make it break. So it's not a recession. We're not close to a recession. That doesn't mean we won't see one in like 4 months or something like that. But right now, you don't create 500,000 jobs in a month and be close to a recession. It just doesn't happen. I will remind everyone about that 500,000 jobs in January. Last February, we had 600,000. And then it immediately reverted back to kind of normal. So this stuff kind of happens. I hope nothing makes it break, that we can ease into this with relatively little pain. And the reason to be optimistic about this is not a typical situation that we see as recessions begin, which usually involves balance sheets in terrible places, businesses and consumers out over their skis. None of that is characteristic of the current environment, which should be hopeful. On the 2% inflation, it wasn't arbitrary. It was it was given a lot of thought. Essentially, the argument was you wanted inflation that wasn't too high. We hate inflation. And by the way, that's another thing we've rediscovered. People don't like inflation, turns out. Poor people fear inflation more than they fear a downturn in the economy based upon some input that we received. And if you think about it, unemployment hits a relatively increases in unemployment hit a relatively small part of the economy, and the people it hits the worst are kind of used to dealing with it. And they have a networks of assistance, networks of family and friends, networks that help them get through it. No one gets away from inflation. You can't turn to your neighbor and say, I want help, because the neighbor's in the same boat you're in. So low inflation is the mantra. It's what we wanted. Why not zero? Well, the idea is you wanted a little bit of a buffer in case when the economy went down, you could cut interest rates and not get to zero. And at the time, the 2% was chosen by central banks all over the world. 2% was thought to be high enough to not run into that zero interest rate problem very often. That has proven to be not so. However, I don't think people have generally been shaken from the view that if we just let the inflation target creep up, that ultimately is going to be a more painful thing than kind of the remedy for what we're seeing now. So, thanks very much. Thanks.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, thank you to Bank of America for sponsoring this event. Really enjoy having David come every year and hear his insights. 2 reminders coming up. We have our next signature events are Chamber Awards on May 17th and the Leadership Chattanooga graduation on May 25th. Thank you again for joining us. If you can give us one more round of applause for David. And have a great day. We'll see you at our next event.